Clara Bennett's alarm buzzed at 4:45 a.m., not because she wanted to wake up that early, but because her body had learned to obey the rhythm of survival. She rolled over in the narrow twin bed, the springs groaning like an old friend who'd heard every sigh she'd ever made. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of the city outside, a low, constant thrum that never really stopped, even in the dead of night. She rubbed her eyes, sat up slowly, and reached for the chipped coffee mug on the nightstand. Cold coffee from yesterday. She didn't mind. It was fuel, not luxury. By 5:15, she was out the door, hoodie zipped, worn sneakers laced tight, and a thermos of reheated coffee tucked into her bag. The walk to the bus stop was short but chilly, the kind of Chicago morning where the wind sliced through layers like it had a personal grudge. She pulled her hood lower and kept her eyes on the sidewalk, not out of shyness, but because she'd learned long ago that looking down made the hours pass faster. Less to see, less to think about. She worked at the Oak and Ivy, a restaurant tucked into a quiet corner of the Gold Coast neighborhood. From the outside, it looked like any other upscale spot. Dark wood, brass handles, soft lighting. But inside, it hummed with a kind of quiet elegance that made even the most confident people lower their voices. Clara had been a waitress there for 3 years. Not because she loved serving rich strangers, but because the tips were steady, the manager didn't micromanage, and, most importantly, they had a piano. Not just any piano. A grand. Black glossy with keys that felt like cool silk under her fingers. It sat in the back lounge, mostly untouched except during weekend jazz nights. But on quiet evenings, after the last guest had left and the kitchen staff had clocked out, Clara would linger. She'd wipe down the last table slowly, then glance toward the piano like it was calling her. And sometimes, if the night was still enough and no one was watching, she'd sit down and play. She never played loud, never played long. Just a few minutes, enough to remind herself that she was still the girl who used to sit at her grandmother's upright piano in rural Indiana, dreaming of concert halls and standing ovations. Back then, music wasn't a secret. It was everything. Her grandmother had saved for years to buy that old piano, and every Sunday after church she'd sit Clara on the bench and teach her chords by ear. Music isn't just sound, she'd say, her hands rough from gardening but gentle on the keys. It's how you talk when words aren't enough. But life had other plans. Her grandmother passed when Clara was 16. College loans piled up faster than she could pay them. And somewhere between working 2 jobs and caring for her mom, who'd been diagnosed with early onset arthritis, Clara stopped believing music could be more than a memory. Still, she never stopped playing, even if it was just in the dark, alone with no one listening. Her shift at the Oak and Ivy started at 6 a.m. for breakfast prep. She'd help set up the dining room, polish silverware, refill water pitchers. The morning crew was small, just her, the chef, and one other server, and they moved like a well-oiled machine. No small talk, just nods and quiet efficiency. By 7:30, the first guests trickled in. Businessmen in crisp suits, tourists with maps, older couples celebrating anniversaries. Clara knew how to read them all. The ones who wanted space, the ones who needed reassurance, the ones who'd snap if their eggs weren't cooked exactly right. She'd learned to smile even when she was exhausted, to remember names after one visit, to pour coffee without spilling a drop. Lunch service was faster, louder, more chaotic. But Clara thrived in the rhythm of it, the clatter of plates, the hiss of the espresso machine, the constant motion. It was the kind of work that didn't leave room for overthinking, and that was a gift. She clocked out at 3 p.m. but never went straight home. Instead, she walked 10 blocks to the public library, where she'd sit at one of the old desktop computers and scroll through free piano tutorials. She couldn't afford lessons, but YouTube had become her teacher. She'd watch a video of a Chopin nocturne 5 times, then go home and try to mimic it on the tiny keyboard she'd bought from a thrift store. Her fingers ached sometimes, but it was a good ache, the kind that meant she was getting better. That evening, she returned to the Oak and Ivy for the dinner shift. She changed into her uniform, a black blouse, tailored slacks, and a name tag that always felt too shiny for someone who spent most of her time clearing crumbs. The restaurant was already buzzing. A private party had been booked in the back room. A birthday celebration for someone important. Judging by the floral arrangements and the extra staff called in, she didn't pay much attention to the guest list. Rich people came and went all the time. Some were kind, leaving generous tips and warm thank yous. Others treated the staff like furniture, present but invisible. Clara had learned not to take it personally. She focused on doing her job well and getting through the night. But this group was different from the start. They arrived in a flurry of laughter and expensive cologne. The man at the center of it all stood out immediately, not just because of his tailored navy suit or the way he held himself like the room existed only for him, but because of the way he looked at people. Like he was already calculating their worth. He dropped his coat on a chair without asking, snapped his fingers for a drink, and laughed too loudly at his own jokes. His name came up in hushed tones among the staff. Julian Thorne. Tech entrepreneur, self-made millionaire, known for throwing outrageous parties and saying whatever came to mind. Clara kept her distance. She served bread, refilled water, cleared appetizer plates, all with the quiet efficiency she'd perfected. But halfway through the main course, as she was clearing a plate of half-eaten steak, she caught herself humming. It was a habit she couldn't break, soft, wordless melodies that slipped out when she was lost in thought. Usually no one noticed, but Julian did. He turned his head sharply, eyes locking onto her like a hawk spotting movement in the grass. "Hey," he called out, voice cutting through the chatter. "You, the waitress." Clara froze, plate in hand. "Yeah, you," he said, gesturing with his wine glass. "Come here." She walked over slowly, heart thudding. "Yes, sir?" He studied her for a moment, then grinned, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard you humming. You sing?" "No, sir, just a habit," he chuckled, turning to his guests. "She's got a little songbird in there." Then back to her. "You play anything?" Clara hesitated. She could lie, say no, walk away. But something in his tone, the mix of amusement and challenge, made her throat tighten. "A little piano," she admitted quietly. The table erupted in laughter, not unkindly at first, but with the kind of indulgent humor people use when they think someone's being cute. Julian leaned back, swirling his wine. "Oh, this I've got to see." "Go on, play us something." Her stomach dropped. I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" he pressed, voice rising slightly. "Afraid you're not good enough?" "Don't worry, we won't judge." He winked at his friends, who laughed again, louder this time. Clara's face burned. She glanced toward the manager, who gave her a tight, apologetic shrug. Private parties meant the guests called the shots, and Julian Thorne wasn't the kind of man you said no to. She looked at the piano. It sat in the corner of the adjacent lounge, bathed in soft amber light. So close, so familiar. And yet, the thought of playing in front of these people who expected her to fumble, to embarrass herself, made her want to run. But running wasn't an option. Not tonight, she took a slow breath. Nodded once. Okay. As she walked toward the piano, the room grew quieter. Conversations dipped. Eyes followed her. She could feel their stares like weights on her shoulders. She sat on the bench, adjusted her blouse, and placed her hands over the keys. They were cool, solid, real. For a moment, she forgot the room, forgot Julian, forgot the fear. All she heard was the silence before the music, and then she began to play. But that was later. For now, in this moment before the first note, Clara was just a woman in a black uniform, sitting alone at a piano in a room full of strangers who thought they knew her. They saw a waitress, a nobody, someone to be amused, then forgotten. They had no idea who she really was. And that, she realized as her fingers hovered above the keys, might just be her secret weapon. The night was far from over, but something had already shifted. Something quiet, powerful, and entirely hers. The silence in the room wasn't the kind that felt peaceful. It was heavy, like the air had thickened, waiting for something to break. Clara sat at the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. She could feel every eye on her back, hear the soft rustle of fabric as guests leaned forward in their chairs. Someone coughed. A glass clinked. Then nothing. She closed her eyes, not to block them out, but to find the music inside herself. The noise of the room faded, replaced by the quiet rhythm of her own breath. She thought of her grandmother's hands, rough from gardening but so gentle on the piano keys. She remembered the way sunlight used to fall across the old upright in their living room, dust dancing in the beams as she practiced scales for the 100th time. Back then, music wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about feeling something real. Her fingers moved. The first note rang out, soft, clear, like a single drop of water in a still pond. Then another. And another. She began with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Op. 9, number 2. Not because it was flashy, but because it carried everything she couldn't say out loud. Longing, tenderness, a quiet kind of strength. At first, the guests didn't react. Maybe they expected clumsy chords, a hesitant nursery rhyme, something to laugh at. But as the melody unfolded, smooth, flowing, full of emotion, their expressions changed. The man who'd been checking his phone lowered it slowly. The woman in the emerald dress stopped mid-sip, her wine glass hovering near her lips. Even the kitchen staff peeking through the service door stood frozen. Julian, the man who'd forced her to play, sat perfectly still. His smirk was gone. His fingers, which had been drumming impatiently on the table just moments before, now lay flat against the linen. He stared at her, not with mockery but with something closer to disbelief. Clara didn't look up. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the room like a change in the weather. The air wasn't heavy anymore. It was alive. Her hands moved with a confidence that surprised even her. Every phrase she played felt like a sentence in a language only she and the piano understood. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was just telling the truth. And somehow, in this room full of strangers who'd seen her as nothing more than someone to serve them, that truth was louder than anything she could have said. When she reached the final notes, soft, lingering like a whispered goodbye, the last sound hung in the air for a heartbeat. Then 2, then 3, and then applause, not polite clapping, not the kind people do to be nice. This was real. Deep, warm, rising from the chest. Someone whistled. Another guest stood up without thinking. The retired concert pianist at the far end of the table, elegant, silver-haired, wearing a simple pearl necklace, wiped her eyes with a napkin and nodded slowly, as if she'd just witnessed something sacred. Clara opened her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted them from the keys. She hadn't planned to play that long, hadn't planned to play that piece. But now that it was over, she felt strangely calm, like she'd finally exhaled after holding her breath for years. She stood up slowly, smoothing her uniform. The room was still applauding. She gave a small, awkward nod, more out of habit than grace, and started to walk back toward the dining area. But Julian stood up. "Wait," he said. His voice quieter now, less sharp. She stopped. He walked over, not with the swagger he'd had before, but with something uncertain in his step. He held out a folded bill, $100 bill, maybe more. "For the performance," he said, holding it out like it was a peace offering. Clara looked at the money. Then at him. She didn't take it. "I didn't play for money," she said simply. He blinked as if the idea hadn't occurred to him. "Then why'd you play?" "Because I love it," she said. And that was all. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there with the cash in his hand and a look on his face like he'd just been handed a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Guests kept glancing at her, some smiling warmly, others whispering behind their hands. One woman stopped her on the way to the kitchen and said, "You have a gift. Don't let anyone make you hide it." Clara just nodded, throat too tight to speak. When the party finally ended nearly 2 hours later, she helped clear the last of the dishes, her body tired but her mind wide awake. The manager pulled her aside near the back door. "That was something else," he said, shaking his head. "I had no idea." "Neither did I," Clara admitted, half joking. He smiled. "Well, don't be surprised if people start asking for you by name." She laughed softly. "I'm still just here to serve coffee and clear plates." "Maybe," he said. "But tonight you reminded everyone that people are more than what they do for a living." She went home that night on the same bus, in the same worn sneakers, but something felt different. Not because of the applause or the stunned faces, but because, for the first time in a long time, she hadn't felt small. The next morning she woke up expecting everything to go back to normal. Same alarm, same cold coffee, same walk to the bus stop, and in many ways it did. The city didn't care about last night's piano performance. The bills still needed paying. Her mom still needed her help with groceries, but when she arrived at the Oak and Ivy for her morning shift, the staff treated her differently. Not in an over-the-top way, no fanfare or standing ovations, but with a new kind of respect. The dishwasher, who rarely spoke, gave her a thumbs up as she passed. The hostess slipped her an extra muffin and whispered, "You were amazing." Even the regulars noticed. An elderly man who came in every Tuesday for oatmeal and tea looked up from his newspaper and said, "Heard you gave quite a show last night. Any chance you'll play again?" Clara smiled. "Only if the piano asks nicely." But as the day went on, a strange feeling settled in her chest. Not pride exactly, but unease. What if people expected her to perform every time she worked? What if they started treating her like entertainment instead of a server? She didn't want to be a sideshow. She just wanted to play when it felt right. That worry stayed with her through lunch and into the afternoon. She even considered calling in sick for the dinner shift, but she needed the hours. So she went in, uniform pressed, hair neatly tied back, ready to serve and stay invisible. She didn't expect to see him again, but there he was, Julian, sitting alone at a corner table near the window, sipping black coffee. No entourage, no loud laughter. Just him looking out at the street like he was waiting for something. Her stomach tightened. She almost asked the manager to reassign her section. But before she could, he looked up and saw her. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just nodded once. She took a breath and walked over. "Can I get you anything else?" He studied her for a long moment. "You didn't take the money." "It wasn't why I played." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." She raised an eyebrow. "To apologize?" He hesitated. "I'm not great at apologies. But I do know when I've been wrong." She waited. "I thought you were just playing along," he said, choosing his words carefully, like most people do when someone like me makes a joke at their expense. "I didn't think you'd actually play, and I definitely didn't think you'd be that good." Clara crossed her arms slightly. "So you came back to hear me again?" "No," he said. "I came back because I owe you something better than $100 bill." She frowned. "I don't want your money." "I'm not offering money," he said. "I'm offering a chance." Now she was curious. "What kind of chance?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's a small arts venue downtown, the Lyric Loft. They host recitals for emerging musicians. I know the owner. I could get you a slot. One night. Just you and the piano. No pressure. No crowd expectations. And I wouldn't tell anyone it was me who set it up." Clara stared at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because last night," he said slowly, "you made me feel like an idiot. Not because you showed off, but because I judged you without knowing anything about you. And that's on me." She didn't answer right away. The idea was tempting. A real stage. A real audience who came to listen, not to eat. But it also terrified her. What if she froze? What if it was a fluke? What if people expected the same magic and she couldn't deliver? "I'd have to think about it," she said finally. "Take your time," he replied. "But don't say no just because you're scared. You've already done the hard part. You showed up." He left shortly after, leaving a generous tip and a business card with just a phone number scribbled on the back. No name, no title. Just a number. That night after her shift, Clara didn't go straight home. She walked to the park near her apartment and sat on a bench under a street lamp. She pulled out the card and turned it over in her hands. Part of her wanted to tear it up, to pretend last night never happened, to go back to being invisible, safe, predictable. But another part, the part that still hummed melodies while washing dishes, that practiced scales on a broken keyboard at midnight, ached for more. She thought about her grandmother, about all the times she'd said, "Don't let fear steal your song." Clara tucked the card into her pocket. She wasn't ready to say yes, but for the first time, she wasn't ready to say no either. Clara didn't call the number right away. She kept the card tucked in the back pocket of her jeans for 3 days, like it was something fragile that might break if she looked at it too long. Every time she reached for her phone or sat down with her morning coffee, she'd feel its edge pressing against her leg, a quiet reminder that a door had opened. Even if she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through it, she tried to go back to normal. She worked her shifts, helped her mom sort through medical bills, practiced on her tiny keyboard in the evenings, but something had shifted inside her, like a compass needle finally finding true north. The music didn't feel like a secret anymore. It felt like a promise. On the 4th night, after tucking her mom into bed and washing the dinner dishes, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea gone cold. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. The city felt hushed, as if holding its breath. She pulled out the card, stared at the number. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she dialed. A man answered on the second ring. "Hello, it's the waitress," she said, voice quieter than she meant it to be. A pause, then, "Oh, hi. I've been thinking about what you said," she continued, gripping the phone tighter. "About the recital. I figured you might. I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted. "I've never played for an audience that wasn't eating steak or checking their watches." "You don't have to be ready," he said. "You just have to be willing," she exhaled. "Okay, let's do it." The date was set for 6 weeks away. A Saturday night at the Lyric Loft, a cozy venue tucked above a bookstore in the West Loop. It wasn't fancy, but it had history. Local jazz trios, poetry slams, solo violinists, all kinds of artists had started there. The owner, a woman named Diane with silver-streaked hair and a no-nonsense smile, met Clara the next week. She didn't ask for a demo tape or a resume. She just listened as Clara played a short piece on the venue's upright piano. Something simple just to test the keys. When Clara finished, Diane nodded. "You've got soul in your fingers." "That's rare." Rehearsals began the following week. Not formal lessons, Clara couldn't afford those, but quiet afternoons at the venue when no one else was around. She'd arrive after her lunch shift, still in her uniform, and lose herself in scales, arpeggios, and the slow, careful shaping of the pieces she'd chosen. Chopin, yes, but also Debussy, a little Bach, and even a few original compositions she'd scribbled in a notebook over the years. She'd never shown them to anyone. Now she was preparing to share them with strangers. The fear never fully left. Some days her hands shook so badly she couldn't hit the right notes. Other days she'd sit at the piano and freeze, convinced she'd forgotten everything. But then she'd remember the silence in that dining room, the way the air changed when she played, and she'd try again. Julian didn't show up to rehearsals. He kept his word. No grand gestures, no hovering. But every Friday, without fail, a plain white envelope would appear in her locker at the Oak and Ivy. Inside was always the same thing, a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. Sometimes it was just a quote, "Music is the space between the notes," or "Courage is not the absence of fear." Other times it was a simple, "You've got this," never signed. Never pushy, just there. She didn't know if he was watching from afar or if he'd already moved on to his next big idea, but the notes helped. They reminded her she wasn't alone in believing this could work. As the recital date neared, word started to spread, not through social media or press releases, but through quiet conversations. The retired pianist from the party told her bridge club. A food critic who'd been at the dinner mentioned it in a newsletter. Even the dishwasher at the restaurant told his cousin, who played cello in a local orchestra. Tickets weren't expensive, just enough to cover the venue's costs, but they started selling faster than anyone expected. 2 weeks before the show, Clara stood in front of the mirror in her apartment, holding up 2 dresses. One was black and simple, elegant but safe. The other was deep blue, with a subtle shimmer, the kind of dress that caught the light without shouting for attention. Her mom, sitting in her wheelchair by the window, pointed to the blue one. "That one," she said softly. "It looks like music," Clara smiled. "Yeah, it does." The night before the recital, she couldn't sleep. She paced the apartment, checked the piano bench 3 times, reheated tea she didn't drink. Her mom, sensing her anxiety, wheeled herself into the living room and turned on the old radio. Classical music filled the room, soft, familiar. "You don't have to be perfect," her mom said, eyes closed, swaying slightly to the rhythm. "You just have to be you." Clara sat beside her, resting her head on her shoulder like she used to as a child. "What if I mess up?" "Then you'll fix it," her mom said simply. "Or you'll keep going. Either way, you'll still be playing. And that's what matters." Morning came too soon. She dressed carefully, hair pulled back in a low bun, the blue dress smooth against her skin. She didn't wear much makeup, just enough to feel like herself. She packed her sheet music, her lucky wristband, a frayed blue string from her grandmother's sewing kit, and a bottle of water. The Oak and Ivy gave her the night off. Even the chef, who rarely spoke more than 3 words at a time, handed her a small box as she left. Inside was a single chocolate croissant, her favorite, and a note that read, "Break a key." But not literally. The Lyric Loft was already buzzing when she arrived at 5 p.m. Diane greeted her with a hug and a strong cup of coffee. "Nerves?" she asked. Like a hummingbird in a thunderstorm, Clara admitted. Good. Means you care. Backstage, if you could call it that, was just a narrow hallway with a folding chair and a mirror. Clara sat down, closed her eyes, and ran through her opening piece in her head. Every note, every breath. At 7:30, the audience began to arrive. She heard the murmur of voices, the clink of programs, the soft shuffle of coats being hung. She peeked through the curtain. The room wasn't huge, maybe 80 seats, but they were filling fast. She saw familiar faces, the silver-haired pianist from the party, the elderly man who ate oatmeal every Tuesday, even the hostess from the restaurant, sitting in the third row with a proud smile, and then she saw him. Julian. He sat in the very back, near the exit, like he was ready to slip out if things got awkward. He wore a plain dark sweater, no suit, no flashy watch. He didn't look around, just kept his eyes on the empty stage, hands folded in his lap. Her heart skipped, not because she was scared of him anymore, but because his presence meant he'd kept his word. He hadn't taken credit. He hadn't made it about himself. He was just here listening. At 8 p.m., Diane stepped onto the stage. Good evening, she said, voice warm and steady. Tonight, we're honored to welcome someone who reminds us that talent doesn't always wear a spotlight. It sometimes wears an apron. Please give a warm welcome to Clara Bennett. The applause started before Clara even walked out. She took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and stepped into the light. The piano waited for her, black, gleaming, patient. She sat down, adjusted the bench, placed her hands on the keys. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then she began. She opened with the Chopin Nocturne, the same piece she'd played that night at the restaurant. But this time it wasn't an act of survival. It was an offering. Her fingers moved with a confidence that surprised even her. The notes flowed like water, sometimes gentle, sometimes deep, always honest. Halfway through, she forgot the audience, forgot the stage, forgot everything except the conversation between her hands and the piano. She played Debussy's Clair de Lune next, dreamy, shimmering, full of moonlight and memory. Then a Bach prelude, crisp and clear like morning air. And finally, her own composition, a short piece she'd written during a sleepless night last winter. She called it Still Here. When the last note faded, the silence returned, but this time it was full, not empty. Then the room erupted, not just applause, but cheers, whistles, people standing, tears in more than a few eyes. Clara stood slowly, heart pounding, and gave a small bow. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Backstage, Diane handed her a tissue. You were magnificent. Clara just nodded, tears finally spilling over. I didn't think I could. You did, Diane said firmly. And you will again. Later, as guests mingled in the lobby, sipping wine and talking about the performance, Clara slipped outside for air. The night was cool, the city lights soft against the sky. She leaned against the brick wall, breathing deeply. A few minutes later, footsteps approached. She didn't turn around. She knew who it was. You were right, Julian said, stopping a few feet away. I didn't play for money. No, he said. You played because it's who you are. They stood in silence for a moment. I'm sorry, he added quietly. For how I treated you. She looked at him then, really looked. He wasn't smirking, wasn't performing. Just a man who'd made a mistake and was trying in his own clumsy way to make it right. Thank you, she said. For giving me the chance, he nodded. Don't thank me. You earned it. Before he left, he handed her a small envelope. Inside was a check, not for her, but made out to the local youth music program. In your name, he said. If you're okay with that. She was. He walked away without another word. Clara stood there for a long time, the envelope in one hand, the city humming around her. She wasn't famous. She wasn't rich. But for the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a waitress, not as a nobody, but as someone who had something real to give, and that, she realized, was enough. The morning after the recital, Clara woke up to her phone buzzing nonstop. At first, she thought it was a wrong number, maybe a telemarketer or a spam alert. But when she squinted at the screen, she saw message after message from people she hadn't heard from in years. Old classmates, distant cousins. Even her high school music teacher who wrote simply, I always knew you'd find your way back. She rolled over in bed, heart thumping. Her mom was already awake, sitting by the window with a cup of tea and newspaper open on her lap. "You're famous," she said with a quiet laugh, nodding toward the phone. "I'm not famous," Clara mumbled, but she couldn't stop smiling. Still, she got up, made coffee, and went through her usual routine, checking her mom's medication, folding laundry, watering the one stubborn basil plant that refused to die. Normal things, grounding things, because even though last night had felt like a dream, today was still just another day, and Bills didn't care how many people clapped for you. But the world outside her apartment had changed. By noon, an email arrived from the head of a local community college's music department. They'd heard about her performance and wanted to offer her a full scholarship to finish her bachelor's in piano performance, something she'd started years ago, but dropped when money ran out. The program was flexible, designed for working adults, classes in the evenings, practice rooms available until midnight. Clara read the email 3 times, then called her mom into the room. "Look at this," she said, voice trembling. Her mom read it slowly, then reached over and squeezed her hand. "It's time," she said. That same afternoon, a woman from a non-profit that supported arts education called. They'd seen a short clip someone posted online, just 30 seconds of Clara playing Still Here, and wanted to know if she'd be interested in teaching piano to kids in underserved neighborhoods. "We pay a fair hourly rate," the woman said, "but more than that, we think you'd be great with them. You understand what it's like to love music when no one's watching." Clara said yes before she even thought it through. The next few weeks passed in a blur of small miracles. The Oak and Ivy offered to keep her on part-time, shifting her to daytime shifts so she could attend classes. Diane from the Lyric Loft booked her for a monthly solo night. No pressure, just a chance to play new pieces and connect with listeners. And the youth program? Her first student was a 9-year-old boy who'd never touched a piano before, but had a rhythm in his bones that reminded her of herself at that age. She didn't suddenly become a star. There were no record deals or national tours, but something deeper was happening, something quieter, more lasting. People started coming to the Oak and Ivy not just for the food, but because they'd heard the waitress played piano like an angel. Sometimes, on slow Tuesday nights, the manager would nod toward the lounge and Clara would sit down and play for 20 minutes while guests sipped wine and listened. No one clapped loudly. No one filmed it. They just listened, and that felt like a gift. One evening, as she was packing up after a lesson with her young student, who'd just played Twinkle Twinkle with surprising confidence, her phone rang. It was the number from the business card. She hadn't heard from him since the recital. She answered cautiously. "Hello? It's me," he said. "Just checking in." She leaned against the piano, smiling. "I'm okay. More than okay." "I saw the article in the neighborhood paper," he said. "The one about you teaching kids. You read the local paper?" "I read the part with your name in it." A pause. Then she asked him, "Why did you really do it?" "Help me, I mean." He was quiet for a moment. "Because I spend most of my days surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear. Last time I saw someone do something beautiful without asking for anything in return. I don't even remember when. It reminded me that not everything has to be a transaction." She understood that, more than she wanted to admit. They talked for a few more minutes about the weather, about how the city felt different in the spring, about nothing important. But it felt human, real, not like the power games of that first night. After they hung up, Clara sat in the empty music room for a long time, fingers resting on the keys. She thought about how close she'd come to saying no, how easily she could have stayed hidden, safe, unseen, and she realized that the bravest thing she'd ever done wasn't playing in front of strangers. It was believing, even for a second, that she deserved to be heard. A month later, she stood in front of her first college class, not as a student this time, but as a guest speaker for an introductory music appreciation course. The professor had invited her to talk about music as a second language, how it speaks when words fail. She wore the blue dress again, not for show, but because it made her feel like herself. The students were young, mostly wide-eyed and unsure, scrolling on their phones until she sat at the piano. Then they looked up. She didn't give a lecture. She just played, a short piece, simple, heartfelt. Then she told them about her grandmother, about working double shifts, about the night she almost walked away from the piano forever. You don't need a fancy school or a rich sponsor to make music, she said, hands resting on her knees. You just need to care enough to show up even when no one's watching. After class, a girl with bright red hair and nervous hands approached her. I play guitar, she whispered. But I'm scared to play in front of anyone. Clara smiled. Then play for yourself first. The rest will come. Later that week, Clara received a package with no return address. Inside was a brand new digital piano, compact weighted keys perfect for her small apartment. Tucked in the box was a note. For the hours you'll spend teaching others. Don't thank me. Just keep playing. She set it up that same night right by the window where the morning light would hit the keys. Her mom watched from her chair, eyes shining. You've come a long way, she said. Not far enough, Clara replied. But I'm on my way. And she was. Every Tuesday and Thursday she taught piano to kids who couldn't afford lessons. Every Monday and Wednesday she attended her own classes, taking notes like any other student, practicing late into the night. On weekends, she played at the Lyric Loft or sometimes just for herself, letting the music fill the quiet corners of her life. She still wore her waitress uniform sometimes, still cleared plates and refilled water glasses. But now, when guests asked if she played, she didn't look down. She just smiled and said, sometimes. And if the night felt right, and the piano was waiting, she'd sit down and play, not to prove anything, not to impress anyone, but because the music was still there, alive in her hands, and it deserved to be shared. One rainy afternoon, as she walked home from class, she passed a busker on the street corner, a young man with a violin playing a folk tune with his eyes closed. People hurried past, umbrellas up, heads down, but Clara stopped. She listened, and when he finished, she dropped a few bills in his case and said, "Keep going. Someone's listening." He looked up, surprised, then nodded. She walked on, heart full, because that's what it was all about. Not fame, not fortune, not even perfection. It was about showing up, about passing the light along. And Clara, once invisible, now carried it gently in everything she did. 2 years passed like pages turning in a well-loved book, quietly, steadily, filled with small moments that added up to something real. Clara still lived in the same apartment, though the walls now held framed sheet music, a photo of her grandmother at the piano, and a child's crayon drawing that read, Miss Clara, Best Teacher. Her mom's health had stabilized, thanks to better care and a stubborn will to see her daughter thrive. And the tiny basil plant, it had grown into a bushy green monster that spilled over the windowsill, thriving on neglect and occasional coffee grounds. Life wasn't perfect. There were still late nights grading student assignments, days when her fingers ached from too much practice, and moments when imposter syndrome whispered that she didn't belong in a conservatory classroom. But those doubts didn't live in her anymore. They just passed through like clouds on a windy day. She'd finished her degree 6 months ago, not with fanfare, but with a quiet ceremony in a sunlit hall, her mom in the front row clapping with tears in her eyes. Afterward, the music department offered her a part-time teaching position. She said yes, not because it paid well, but because it meant she could keep guiding kids who saw music as a lifeline, not a luxury. The Oak and Ivy was still her home away from home, though she only worked weekends now. The staff treated her like family, and the regulars still asked if she'd play just one song before closing. She usually did, not because she had to, but because she liked the way the piano sounded in that room, the way the wood absorbed the notes, the way silence fell when she began to play. It reminded her where she'd started. She never became famous in the way people imagine. No album deals, no concert halls packed with thousands. But in her own way, she'd built something rarer, a life that made sense. A life where her hands did more than serve, they created. Where her voice, though seldom loud, was always true. Every season, she played a recital at the Lyric Loft, not to sell tickets, but to mark time, to show how far she'd come, not just in technique, but in courage. Her programs grew more personal, pieces she'd composed during sleepless nights, arrangements of folk songs her grandmother used to hum, even a tribute to the dishwasher at the restaurant who'd once told her, "Music keeps the soul from rusting." And every time, without fail, a single white rose would appear on the piano bench before she walked on stage. No note, no signature. Just the rose, fresh and fragrant, placed with care. She never asked who left it. She didn't need to. She knew. One spring evening, as she was packing up after a lesson with her youngest student, a shy 6-year-old who'd just played her first full scale without stopping, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Diane at the Lyric Loft. "We've got a surprise guest tonight. Save a seat?" Clara frowned. She wasn't scheduled to play, but curiosity got the better of her. She changed out of her teaching clothes, put on a simple dress, and walked downtown as the sun dipped below the skyline. The venue was fuller than usual. Not packed, but warm, intimate, the kind of crowd that came for the music, not the spectacle. She slipped into a seat near the back, unnoticed. Then the lights dimmed. A man walked onto the stage. Not Julian, someone older with silver hair and kind eyes. He sat at the piano and began to play a piece Clara recognized instantly. Her own composition, Still Here. But he played it with a depth, a maturity, that made her breath catch. He'd added harmonies she'd never imagined, stretched the pauses just enough to let the emotion breathe. Afterward, the audience applauded warmly. Diane stepped forward. "That was Professor Alan Reeves," she announced, "former head of piano studies at the conservatory. And tonight, he wanted to honor a composer whose work moved him deeply." The professor stood, adjusted his glasses, and smiled. "I heard this piece played in a restaurant 2 years ago by a young woman who thought no one was listening. But someone was, and that piece changed how I hear music. So tonight I dedicate this performance to Clara Bennett, not just for her talent but for her honesty." Clara's eyes filled. She ducked her head, heart pounding. When she looked up, she saw Julian standing near the exit, arms crossed, watching her with a quiet smile. He gave a small nod, then slipped out before she could approach him. Later, as she walked home under a sky full of stars, she passed a park where a group of teenagers were gathered around a portable speaker, laughing and dancing. One of them was playing a melody on a cheap keyboard, fingers clumsy but full of joy. Clara paused, listening. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. She kept walking, smiling to herself. A few days later, she received an invitation, not to a gala or a red carpet event, but to a community center on the South Side. A local nonprofit was launching a new music room for kids, funded by a quiet donor who insisted on anonymity. They wanted her to cut the ribbon and play the first notes on the new piano. She said yes immediately. The day of the event, the room was buzzing with children, parents, teachers, all excited about the shiny black piano in the center of the room. Clara stood at the front, ribbon scissors in hand, and felt a wave of gratitude so deep it nearly knocked her over. This was better than any spotlight. This was legacy. She played a simple melody, something easy for little ears to follow. Then she invited the kids to come up and try. Within minutes, the piano was surrounded by small hands pressing keys, giggling at the sounds they made. One boy played a single note over and over, grinning like he'd discovered magic. Afterward, as she was helping clean up, a woman approached her. Tired eyes, worn coat, but a warm smile. "My son's the one who wouldn't stop hitting middle C," she said. "He's never touched a real piano before. Thank you for this." Clara hugged her. "Thank you for letting him try." That night, she sat at her own piano, the one by the window, and played for no one but herself. Not Chopin, not Debussy, not even her own compositions. Just a simple folk tune her grandmother used to sing while kneading bread. The notes floated out into the quiet apartment, wrapping around her like an old blanket. Her mom dozed in her chair, a soft smile on her face. Clara didn't need applause anymore. She didn't need validation from strangers or grand gestures from millionaires. What she had was enough, a purpose, a craft, and the quiet joy of knowing that music hadn't just saved her. It was now saving others, one hesitant note at a time. Sometimes, on slow Sunday mornings, she'd return to the Oak and Ivy just to sit in the lounge with a cup of tea. The staff would wave, the chef would send over a pastry, and if the piano was empty, she'd play a few bars, just for the pleasure of it. Guests would pause, listen, then go back to their conversations. No fanfare, no expectations. Just music doing what it always did, connecting people without saying a word. And every now and then, when the light hit the keys just right, she'd catch a glimpse of her reflection in the polished wood. Older, wiser, still a little tired around the eyes, but smiling. Not because she'd made it, but because she'd finally stopped running from who she was. She was a waitress. A teacher, a daughter, a composer, a student, a friend, and above all, she was someone who played piano, not for fame, not for fortune, but because the world felt more bearable when she did. Years later, long after the headlines faded and the recitals became quiet traditions, people would still talk about the night a millionaire tried to embarrass a waitress and ended up discovering a quiet kind of magic. But Clara never told that story for attention. She told it, when she told it at all, to remind her students, never let anyone decide your worth based on your job, your clothes, or the size of your bank account, because sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that start in silence, and sometimes all it takes is one note, played with honesty, to change everything. There was no grand finale, no final bow under blinding lights. Life didn't work that way, not for people like Clara. Instead, it unfolded in small, steady moments, a student nailing a difficult scale after weeks of stumbling, a rainy afternoon spent rereading old sheet music, the way her mom's eyes still lit up when she heard the opening notes of Claire de Lune drifting from the next room. But something new began to stir, not in her career, but in her heart. It started on a Tuesday. During her usual afternoon class at the community center, she was helping a 10-year-old named Leo, who'd been coming for 6 months. He was quiet, wore mismatched socks, and always arrived with a backpack too big for his shoulders. That day, he played a short piece he'd written himself. Just 8 bars, simple but full of feeling. When he finished, he looked up at her, eyes wide. "Do you think someone would ever want to hear that?" Clara knelt beside the bench. "Leo," she said gently, "someone already did." He smiled, a real one, not the cautious half-smile he usually offered, and in that moment, she saw herself. Not as she was now, but as she'd been 2 years ago. Talented, unsure, waiting for permission to believe she mattered. That night, she couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety, but from a quiet urgency. She'd been teaching, performing, healing, but she hadn't yet built something that would last beyond her own hands. Music was fleeting. A recital ended, a lesson finished. But what if she could create a place where music wasn't just taught, but nurtured? A place where kids like Leo and like her younger self could walk in tired and walk out feeling seen? The idea took root like a seed in good soil. She started small. She talked to Diane at the Lyric Loft about using the space on Sunday mornings for free beginner classes. Diane agreed instantly. "You've already filled this place with soul," she said. "Let's give it away." Then Clara reached out to the local library, the community center, even the after-school program at the elementary school down the street. She didn't ask for money. She asked for space, for time, for trust. And slowly, people said yes. She called it Open Keys. Not a school, not a studio, just an open door. Every Sunday from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., anyone under 18 could come and try any instrument they wanted. No fees, no auditions, no judgment. Just a piano, a few guitars, a keyboard, and Clara, and soon a handful of volunteer teachers who'd heard what she was doing and wanted to help. The first Sunday, only 3 kids showed up. One played the piano with one finger. Another strummed a guitar like it was a mystery to be solved. The third just sat and listened. Clara made hot chocolate, played a short piece to welcome them, and let the room fill with the beautiful mess of learning. By the 3rd week, there were 10. By the 2nd month, 20. Parents lingered in the hallway, not out of suspicion but wonder. "My daughter's never wanted to do anything after school," one mother admitted, watching her child carefully press piano keys. "But she asks every Friday if Sunday's coming." Clara didn't take credit. She just showed up rain or shine with sheet music, patience, and the quiet belief that every child deserved a chance to find their voice, even if it came out as a wrong note at first. One afternoon, as she was locking up after a session, she found an envelope taped to the piano. Inside was a check enough to cover 6 months of instrument rentals and sheet music, and a note. "For the kids who haven't found their song yet, keep the door open." She recognized the handwriting. She didn't call. She just cashed the check and bought a second keyboard. Her days grew fuller but not heavier. She still taught at the conservatory 2 days a week, still played weekend sets at the Oak and Ivy, still helped her mom with errands and doctor's appointments. But now Sundays belonged to Open Keys and to something deeper, purpose. One spring morning, as cherry blossoms drifted past the windows of the loft, A new face appeared at the door. A girl, maybe 12, stood just outside, gripping the strap of her backpack like it was a lifeline. She didn't come in, just watched through the glass as other kids laughed and played. Clara walked over and opened the door. "Hi," she said softly. "You can come in." The girl shook her head. "I don't know how." "That's why we're here," Clara said. "To learn together." The girl hesitated, then stepped inside. Her name was Maya. She'd lost her dad the year before. Her mom worked double shifts. She hadn't spoken much since. But that day she sat at the piano and pressed one key, then another. By the end of the hour she'd played a 3-note melody, simple, sad, and stunningly brave. Clara didn't say much, just sat beside her and played a harmony underneath, turning her 3 notes into something whole. After that, Maya came every Sunday. Months passed. Seasons turned. Open Keys became a quiet landmark in the neighborhood, not famous but known. Local musicians dropped by to jam. A retired violinist started teaching strings. A high school student with a passion for composition began leading songwriting circles. And through it all, Clara remained the steady center, not a star but a shelter. One evening, as she was walking home from the conservatory, her phone rang. It was the head of a small arts foundation. They'd heard about Open Keys through a teacher who'd sent her niece to the program. They wanted to offer a grant, not a huge amount, but enough to rent a permanent space, buy a few more instruments, maybe even hire a part-time assistant. Clara sat on a bench under a street lamp and cried, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of being believed in. She accepted the grant, but with one condition: the space had to stay free for kids, always. They found a storefront on a quiet block, once a laundromat, then a flower shop, then empty for years. Clara and a group of volunteers spent weekends painting walls, building shelves, tuning donated instruments. They hung string lights, put up a chalkboard for song requests, and placed a small bench by the window labeled "For Listening." On opening day, the line stretched down the block. Not for fame, not for spectacle, just for a chance to touch a piano, to make a sound that was theirs alone. Clara stood in the doorway, watching kids stream in, some shy, some loud, all curious. Her mom sat in a corner chair, wrapped in a shawl, smiling as a little boy showed her how to press a key. Later that night, alone in the empty space, Clara sat at the main piano, the one she'd chosen herself. With a warm tone and keys that felt like home, she played a piece she'd been working on for months. It didn't have a name yet, but it carried everything: the fear, the hope, the quiet triumph of ordinary people choosing to believe in beauty. When she finished, she turned off the lights and locked the door. As she walked home, the city hummed around her: cars, distant laughter, the rustle of leaves. But inside there was peace. She wasn't the waitress who got embarrassed anymore. She wasn't even just the pianist who amazed a room. She was the woman who opened a door and kept it open. And that, she realized, was the truest kind of success. Because legacy wasn't built in headlines or sold-out halls. It was built in Sunday mornings, in hesitant fingers on piano keys, in the space between a child's doubt and their first note of courage. And Clara? She'd found her place, not on a stage, but in the quiet act of making room for others to shine. Years from now, when people asked how it all began, she'd smile and say, "It started with someone forcing me to play, and me choosing to keep going." But the real story wasn't about that night. It was about every day after. The days she showed up, the days she listened, the days she believed, first in herself, then in everyone else, and in the end, that was more than enough.